Daniel had always loved his home, a charming suburban house with a spacious backyard where he spent his weekends gardening, grilling, and enjoying the peace of nature. He had lived there for over 15 years, proudly maintaining his property and paying his dues to the Homeowners Association, HOA, despite their frequent overreach. The HOA, led by an overbearing woman named Karen, had long been a thorn in his side, constantly nitpicking his yard maintenance and issuing ridiculous fines for trivial infractions. But nothing could have prepared him for the day he came home to the sound of construction equipment rumbling in his backyard. Shocked, he ran outside, only to find his entire backyard fenced off, with workers operating heavy machinery, digging up the ground, and setting the foundation for a massive new building. Confused and furious, Daniel demanded answers, but the construction foreman merely shrugged and handed him a notice, stating that the land had been purchased by a developer for a luxury condominium project. Panic set in as he tried to understand how this could have happened. His backyard was still his property, wasn't it? After frantically searching for his property deed and reviewing his paperwork, Daniel was horrified to discover that, according to the county records, the land had been sold months ago. His name had been removed from ownership, replaced by that of a real estate developer who was known for aggressive urban projects. Stunned and feeling an overwhelming sense of betrayal, Daniel stormed into the HOA office to confront Karen. She greeted him with a smug smirk, barely looking up from her desk as he demanded an explanation. "Oh, that? It was a necessary move for community," she said, feigning innocence. "Your backyard was underutilized, and the HOA board voted to sell it to fund improvements for the neighborhood." Daniel could hardly believe his ears. "Underutilized? That was my property. You had no right to sell it," he shouted, his hands shaking with rage. But Karen only chuckled. "The paperwork says otherwise," she said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. Sure enough, there was a deed transfer, complete with signatures. Except, to his horror, Daniel saw his own signature forged at the bottom of the page. He pointed it out, but Karen merely shrugged. "You can take it up with the board," she said, already moving on to another task, dismissing him as if his concerns were meaningless. Fueled by outrage, Daniel sought legal help, only to face another roadblock. The HOA sale had been legally processed, and the developer had already begun construction under an official permit. The legal fees to fight it would be astronomical, and worse, Karen had rallied the HOA members to support the sale, citing promises of increased property values once the condos were built. It felt like the entire system was stacked against him. But Daniel wasn't going to roll over and let them steal his land. He vowed then and there that he would find a way to take back what was rightfully his, no matter what it took. Daniel spent the next several days oscillating between rage, frustration, and disbelief. He pored over legal documents, scoured property laws, and contacted every lawyer he could find who would take his case. Each consultation ended with the same frustrating conclusion. While it was clear that fraud had occurred, the sale had been legally processed. Even if he could prove the signature was forged, the bureaucratic mess of reversing the transaction would take years. Years in which the construction would continue, and his backyard would be completely unrecognizable. The developer, a ruthless corporation known for its aggressive expansion tactics, had an army of lawyers ready to squash any resistance. Worse, Karen and the HOA board had covered their tracks well, ensuring the sale appeared legitimate on all official records. The realization hit him like a gut punch. He had lost his backyard, the land that once belonged to him, the place where he had hosted barbecues, grown his favorite tomatoes, and spent quiet evenings with book, was now a construction zone for a luxury condominium complex. The thought made his blood boil. But then, as he sat in his living room staring out at the half-built foundation being laid, something clicked in his mind. He had been so focused on fighting the fraud in court that he hadn't considered a different approach. If the law wasn't on his side, maybe the law could still be his weapon. He just needed to find the right angle. And then he did. Digging through county zoning laws and property regulations, Daniel found a loophole so glaringly obvious that he couldn't believe it hadn't been caught earlier. The land had been rezoned for residential use, but the sale itself had been fraudulent. and because his name was still legally attached to an adjoining lot. He retained certain rights over any construction that encroached on his original property. More importantly, the permits issued to the developer have been based on a zoning approval that required explicit permission from all adjacent property owners, permission that he had never given. Legally speaking, the construction itself was a violation of zoning laws. A slow grin spread across his face as he realized what this meant. He couldn't stop the sale, but he could stop the development. The next morning, Daniel made his move. He hired a surveyor to reaffirm the original property boundaries and filed an official complaint with the county zoning office. Within days, the construction project was slapped with a stop work order. The developer was livid. Karen and the HOA board were furious. They tried to appeal, claiming that the sale was final, but Daniel had the perfect counterstrike waiting. If they wanted to argue legality, he would too, and he had proof that the zoning requirements had been ignored. While the HOA scrambled to fight the zoning dispute, Daniel took things a step further. He leveraged an old law that allowed property owners to reclaim land if a sale had been processed fraudulently and the land was not yet permanently altered. The condominium project, though under construction, had not yet been completed, meaning it was in a legally gray area. He filed a legal motion to reclaim the land and, after weeks of back and forth, won a temporary injunction. That was all he needed. One crisp morning, with the developer's lawyers still reeling from the court ruling, Daniel did what no one expected. He called in a demolition crew. The workers arrived in the early hours, their bulldozers and wrecking equipment ready. As Karen and several HOA members rushed to the site, screaming in horror, Daniel handed the foreman the necessary paperwork. "This building is an illegal structure," he said with a smirk, "and I have every right to remove it." Karen was apoplectic. She screamed about lawsuits, threatened to call the police, and even attempted to block the machines from entering the site. But it was useless. The demolition crew had the legal go-ahead, and within hours, the half-built luxury condos that had stolen his backyard were nothing but rubble. The HOA board stood in stunned silence as they watched their grand project collapse, both literally and figuratively. The developer, realizing that the battle wasn't worth the cost, pulled out of the deal entirely. And just like that, Daniel had taken back what was his. But it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. And as she regrouped with her remaining allies in the HOA, she prepared for one final desperate attempt to claw back control. As the dust settled from the demolished construction site, Daniel felt the first true sense of victory since this entire nightmare had begun. His backyard, though now a pile of rubble and broken concrete, was once again his. The fraudulent sale had been overturned in practice, if not on paper, and the developers had pulled out, realizing the mess wasn't worth the investment. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly, and sure enough, she struck back harder than ever. The very next day, Daniel received an official HOA violation notice in his mailbox. The reason? Unsightly property conditions. The nerve of it nearly made him laugh out loud. Karen and the HOA board had watched as their pet project crumbled, literally. And now, they were trying to punish him for the aftermath. The notice demanded he clean up his yard immediately or face a fine of $500 per day. Daniel had expected this. He knew Karen wasn't just going to walk away and accept that she had lost. What he didn't expect, however, was the depth of her pettiness. Over the following weeks, he received multiple notices. One for excessive noise when he had the debris hauled away, another for landscaping violations because his grass hadn't regrown overnight, and even a ridiculous fine for dangerous conditions when a piece of construction material was temporarily stored near his garage. It was clear what was happening. Karen and the HOA were trying to bury him in fines, forcing him into submission. But Daniel was done playing defense. If Karen wanted a war, he was ready to give her one. The first thing he did was request a full audit of the HOA's financial records. As a homeowner, he had every right to know how his dues were being spent. And given the amount of corruption he had already uncovered, he had a strong suspicion that the HOA wasn't as clean as it pretended to be. Predictably, Karen refused, citing privacy concerns and claiming that the board was not obligated to share financial details with homeowners. That was a mistake. Daniel immediately took the issue to the county's HOA regulatory board, filing an official complaint. He then rallied several other frustrated homeowners who had also been on the receiving end of Karen's draconian rules. Together, they petitioned for a vote of no confidence against the HOA board. That was when the cracks in Karen's empire truly began to show. At first, she tried to intimidate the homeowners who supported Daniel. They received sudden, baseless violation notices, much like he had. Some were even threatened with legal action if they didn't withdraw their support. But the more aggressive Karen became, the more people saw her for what she really was. Homeowners who had previously been indifferent now started asking questions. Where was all the HOA money going? Why had the backyard sale been handled so secretly? And why did Karen have such unchecked authority over everything? The tipping point came when Daniel finally got his hands on the HOA's financial records, thanks to a former board member who had grown disillusioned with Karen's leadership. The numbers were worse than even he had imagined. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into administrative fees that had no clear explanation. Karen had approved extravagant personal expenses under guise of community improvements, including first-class flights to HOA conventions, expensive dinners at high-end restaurants, and even a paid weekend at a luxury resort, all on HOA funds. Even worse, Daniel uncovered evidence that Karen had personally profited from the backyard sale, receiving a hefty under-the-table facilitation fee from the developer before the deal had even been finalized. Armed with this evidence, Daniel went public. He printed copies of the financial records and mailed them to every homeowner in the neighborhood. He created a website exposing the corruption and even reached out to local news stations. Within days, Karen's iron grip on the HOA crumbled. The board was forced to hold an emergency meeting due to the overwhelming demand for answers. It was the largest turnout in the HOA's history, with nearly every homeowner present. Karen, for the first time, looked genuinely nervous. She tried to spin the accusations as misunderstandings, but when faced with hard evidence, even her most loyal supporters began to turn against her. The vote of no confidence passed overwhelmingly. Karen was removed as HOA president effective immediately. The remaining board members, desperate to save face, voted to dissolve the HOA entirely, fearing further legal action. In one fell swoop, the organization that had terrorized Daniel and his neighbors for years was gone. But Karen's troubles were far from over. With her corrupt financial dealings exposed, she quickly found herself facing real legal consequences. Several homeowners, including Daniel, filed civil lawsuits against her for fraud and embezzlement. The county also launched an official investigation, and as more details emerged, it became clear that Karen had been involved in multiple shady dealings beyond just Daniel's backyard sale. Her downfall was swift and brutal. Within months, she was drowning in legal fees, forced to sell her home just to stay afloat. The once powerful HOA queen who had ruled over the neighborhood with an iron fist had lost everything. As for Daniel, he finally reclaimed his backyard in full. With the HOA gone, he was free to rebuild it however he pleased. He spent the following months restoring the space, turning it into something even better than before. And as he stood in the middle of his newly landscaped yard, the warm sun shining down on him, he couldn't help but smile. Karen was gone. The HOA was gone. And at last, peace had returned to his neighborhood.